For as long as the United States has been a country, journalism in one shape or another has been present. Print journalism, specifically newspapers, have been the primary method for delivering journalistic work. Whether it was in the form of the Boston Gazette or the Philadelphia Aurora towards the beginning of the United States, the New York Herald and the New York Tribune in the mid-1800s, or the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal in more recent memory, professional newspapers have been around to cover and write about news. But with the explosion and usage of technological advances such as the computer and the internet, the dust is settling, and the demand and readership of print daily newspapers is going down. To see how the decline of print journalism is taking place, let's look at the history of print journalism.
The first known reference to a journalistic product was a circular called the Acta Diurna in ancient Rome. The Acta Diurna was a daily publication that was posted all around the city to keep the citizens of Rome informed on gladiator contests, executions, important marriages, and public appointments. Similar publications to this also appeared in ancient China and in medieval Europe. The first newspaper to appear in America was a one-time publication called Public Occurrences. It was created by a man named Benjamin Harris and was intended to be a monthly news series. However, the governor of Massachusetts at the time, William Phips, stopped it after just one issue due to the paper's slander of the British government. The first newspaper to actually survive long enough to gain a reputation was the Boston News Letter in 1704. It was started by a postmaker named John Campbell and was a staple of Boston News for 72 years. Around the time of the Revolutionary War, newspapers were common throughout all of the U.S. colonies. However, these newspapers would often take information from rival publications, which led to secondhand information that was almost always inaccurate and misquoted. It took a while for society to start to view journalism as a legit career path. It was perceived to be the preferred job for people who wanted to avoid doing actual work. As time progressed, journalists began to come together to try to get recognition for the hard work that they were doing. As a result, the American Newspaper Guild was created in 1933 to be a trade union and a professional organization for journalists. Journalism was officially recognized as an area of academic study in 1879 when the University of Missouri offered it as a 4-year course. Columbia University followed by offering journalism as a graduate program in 1912. You can't talk about the history of journalism without mentioning both Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst. Joseph Pulitzer was an American publisher and editor who helped create the pattern for a modern newspaper. Pulitzer's first job in the field of journalism was as a reporter for a German newspaper called the Westliche Post. He bought a share of the newspaper in 1871, but he eventually resold it for a profit. In 1874, Pulitzer acquired another German paper called Staatszeitung. Pulitzer went on to become the owner and publisher of the New York World and the benefactor of what we now know as the Pulitzer Prize, the highest award that could be offered to a journalist. William Hearst was known for publishing the biggest chain of newspapers in America in the late 19th century. He's also known for great yellow journalism.
As the United States would grow and experience the events of the rest of the 18th and 19th century, it wasn't until the 20th century when daily newspapers would reach its highest functioning capacity. This was when the United States struggled to form what a democracy looked like, but this is where journalism and daily newspapers come in. A free press, or a daily newspaper more specifically, functions as a central component of trying to obtain a healthy democracy. It acts as a way for citizens to check and report on the events and issues of the culture, society, or population they're a part of. It's a way for the general public to be aware of the times they're in and give them the resources and knowledge to choose what to think about. The peak of print journalism and newspapers within the United States were influencing the culture of the day and acted as the main source of information for people to consume. This allowed for them to know what was going on outside of their individual lives. The peak of newspapers was during the times of roughly 1950 to 1980. During this period, before computers were invented in 1984 and the internet soon after, newspapers were the backbone of daily news consumption and functioned under the First Amendment of the Constitution, which is the freedom of the press. Newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post are certainly daily newspapers and work to cover news mainly at a national scale, but they can't cover everything. This is where smaller scale and local newspapers come in, like the Detroit Free Press and the Grand Rapids Press, for example. They cover some national events but are able to cover local news to inform their readers about what's happening in their respective communities. Yet the number of daily newspapers across the country is declining. According to a graph on journalism.org, the total amount of daily newspapers in the U.S. was 1,772 in 1950, and would plateau with minimal fluctuation until 1980, when the number would drop over the course of the next 5 years to 1,676 in 1985. That number would continue to decline according to Statista.com, that documents the total number of daily newspapers have dropped to 1,331 in 2014 and still slowly going down.
Radio existed in the 1890s. However, it evolved in 1920 with the broadcast of KDKA, which became the benchmark of radio stations. Radio became a huge deal for society because this is when news became available at a faster rate. Radio effects on the society was that it was intimate and immediate, meaning intimacy was created between society because they could listen to the news within the comfort of their own home or space, and it was immediate because they did not have to wait until the newspapers got delivered for the news. Based on the voice, radio is a uniquely personal medium, invoking a listener's imagination to fill in mental images around the broadcast sounds. Just as audience of the time were accustomed to seeing motion pictures without sound, they learned how to envision their own images to accompany audible dramas. By enlisting the support of the listener's imagination, Golden Age radio combined dialogue, sound effects, music, and occasional narration to paint images with sound. As a result, the best radio writers were those who thought visually and those who could create their visions through the art of listening. As we move on into later years is when television became more popular and began to drown out print journalism due to visual aids. At the midpoint of the 20th century, the public was intrigued about being able to see and hear actual events that were happening across town or hundreds of miles away. Relatively few people had sets in their own home, but popular fascination with TV was so pronounced that crowds would gather onto the sidewalks in front of stores that display a working television set or two. With television being a new visual for society, it was easier for people to understand and enjoy television because they no longer had to create images in their head or analyze what they were hearing through the radio. The picture was directly in their face.
The media, and especially daily newspapers, are shifting to new frontiers in how news is delivered. It's been primarily radio, television, print, and Twitter posts, among others, and will continue to see change in the process of how people consume it. But the history of journalism and the impact it has had on shaping the course of history, that won't change. People in one capacity or another will always have an appetite for news and what's going on around them. So even as the popularity of print newspapers dwindle, journalism won't go away. It's how journalism is presented that will change. How exactly? Only time will tell.